everybody. I am Gary Brown. I am an alcoholic. I'm glad to be here, I think. Thank you. I'm glad. He just told me. I'm grateful to be here. I want to thank the committee and Bill G. Now, you notice I blew my anonymity, but his home group, the Journey Group, asked me not to blow his. They didn't want to be identified with Bill G. for some reason. I'm not sure what that was about, but I got a feeling he took us on he took some of us to the falls yesterday, and we took the cable car out over the whirlpool, and he didn't want to go. And last night, Speaker and myself, we kind of shamed him into it. In fact, we bought, and so we got out there, and we get on the tram, and we go out. And of course, we were sitting on the whirlpool side on the way out, and that wasn't too bad. It was pretty gentle. And we got out there, and then they make everybody get up and change sides of the car. And so when you come back, you're looking over the rapids down below, and it's an entirely different effect. I mean, if you lean over like I did and look, it kind of feels like it's drawing you over. And I looked over at Bill, and I said, "That's a little different, isn't it?" He's hanging on like this. And this English lady leaned over and touched him on the hand, and she says, "Your knuckles are white." And they were. And that wasn't the first time. That's right, he was white like that. Exactly. But I really am grateful here, and it's been a wonderful time, and you're a wonderful bunch. You don't get this opportunity to get around a conference quite like this one, and it's created a number of things for me that I suppose are good and bad. I called Julie, my wife, a little earlier, and just to kind of check in and make sure she was doing things the way I told her. And why are you laughing? And she says, "Well, tell me about the conference up there and all that." And I says, "Well, it's really an old one. It's been going on. This is the 54th annual Fall Buffalo Conference." And she says, "Well, gee, you're older than the conference." And so when I told Bill I was up in my room meditating before the talk tonight, I was writing inventory. And Julie, of course, is on the first column, along with Joe, what's his name down there. Was anybody else here at this afternoon's meeting when he talked and all that? I just want to straighten a couple of things out. He said I was a psychopathic farmer. No, he said I was a simple psychopathic farmer from Indiana. That's right, that's what he said. Yeah. And the truth is, at least I think it is I'm a psychopathic cowboy from Wyoming originally, and there's a difference. And you need to get that straight, honk. That's right. We have a little history, and it was kind of brought here to this weekend, and it kind of surprised me to see what was going on. When I first got the invitation, and they said, "Well, Joe is going to be here," and then they said Janice is going to be here. I had heard of Janice from Don P., and so I knew about her, and I thought, I wonder if these poor people in Buffalo realize they're just getting clobbered by Denver this weekend. And because that's where our history is from. Yeah. Now's your chance. Get up and go. We'll thin this puppy down quick. They're not. At any rate, I'll get to that. I found let me kind of get started. My dry date's the 3rd day of December, 1964. And I came, thank you. Now, we had a Texan here last night that got up and talked, and if you ever gone to a meeting in Texas and all that, they always give their dry date before they talk, even in a discussion meeting. They really do. And they got these wonderful little stories they tell to introduce their dry date. And I asked an old-timer down there named Bob White years ago, I says, why do they do that in Texas? He says, that's just so we know we got one. I always thought that was nice, but I do it because I'm bragging. I've decided any other reason was bull, and that's why. I found AA in a nut house in Evanston, Wyoming, like I say, on the 30th of December, 1964. It was a month or so before my 25th birthday. I was 6 foot 2 inches tall, weighed something less than 130 pounds, and that's skinny. You walk fast, your legs whistle. And I was dying. I had become everything I despised. And I say that sincerely, and I hope there's somebody in here that'll think about that. Because I literally despised everything about me. And I don't know what that had to do with alcoholism, but I hated myself. And I don't know any other way to put that. I had no clue that I was dying, and I didn't really find that out for some. There's a whole lot of things I didn't find out real quick right there. They kind of locked me off in a room by myself. They were pretty sure I was alcoholic, but because back in 1964 they didn't see too many that young. And physically I was pretty well beat up. I was a fighter. I wasn't a winner. I was a fighter. And there's a guy down here nodding. Oh, I know about that. And I was truly in very bad shape. And they locked me in a room by myself, and they gave me the drugs of the times to help somebody go through the withdrawal, and they're not the same things they talk about today. I imagine the man here knows what I'm talking about. Paraldehyde was one of them. And you could tell the people that had it because they smelled longer than I used to smell on vodka. It was just it stayed with you a while. I had no clue what I'd gotten into. And what had brought me to that point, I guess, is I didn't drink long. I remember sampling liquor, and that's stealing it out of my dad's wine bottle, or where I could find some here and there. It was really a pretty young child, and I had no idea what that is, 12, 13, 4, I really don't know. With that, I lived out in the country on an experimental farm outside of Cheyenne, Wyoming. I was not an experiment. I want you to know that. I don't think. And out in Wyoming, you can get up on top of a hill and places out there, and you can turn all 4 directions and turn around and not see another sign of men, save a barbed wire fence. I mean, you're not going to see a little town just over there or that kind of a thing. And I was pretty much alone, and you'd get out there, and every once in a while you'd walk along these lanes or these roads, and you'd find an empty bottle laying along the side. And as a kid, I was always down there getting those bottles, holding it up like this, trying to get the last drop to fall out. Kind of, it was going to get it. And I was always kind of fascinated by booze. I used to watch my dad when he drank. My dad was 5 foot 6 inches tall and weighed 120 pounds soaking wet, and had a small man's attitude. Yeah, he was ticked off most of the time. Invariably, I do that, and somebody comes up after the meeting and says, "Listen." But when he drank, something would change. When he drank, he became fun to be around, and there's a lot of things different. So I knew early on that there was something magic in it, and I was fascinated by it. Now, what else was going on with me during that time as a child? And my earliest memories as a child is the one of sitting in the back of the room in class and not supposed to be there. That had to be something going on for somebody else, because I just wasn't like these people. I'd sit back there, and it felt like I was the only one there. You know, I had a big wart here on the end of my nose, and y'all couldn't see it, but it was there. And that's how I felt it was just. And so I was kind of a setup for these things that were going to happen to me, because as I grew older, that feeling got worse. and the less and less I belonged. And by the time I got into the 7th or 8th grade in there, I was a basket case. You know, at that time, you're really kind of getting interested in girls and other things like that. And I'd watch all my friends getting out and doing all that, and I always thought it was going to be a great idea. But I just couldn't do it. I just was totally unable to do that. And so anyway, that was just me. I was a kid in the back of the room that just didn't want any attention brought to me. And so that meant I was not going to do anything in class one way or the other to start any trouble. I wasn't going to do anything to draw attention to myself. That meant I wasn't going to know the answers to any of her questions, which is a good deal because I really didn't know the answers to them. And I just couldn't stand that. By the time I was a sophomore in high school, and got a hold of enough. Well, I'll tell you about that. I was 2 other guys and myself had driven from Cheyenne over to Laramie to the state basketball tournament this year. I guess I'd have been 15 or 16. And we got over there, and we found a guy to buy us a quart of Four Roses and some Coke. That's Coca-Cola. You got to explain that stuff anymore. And the 2 I was with picked up a couple of girls, and we all jumped into the car and we took off for the boondocks. Keep in mind this point because several years later I'm recalling this weekend. Here we had the booze in the car, and we had the girls in the car, and we're heading for the woods, and we didn't know what to do with either one. Hey, you couldn't go down to the drugstore then and buy the directions like you can now, you know. So anyway, we popped the top of that bottle, and I did it just like I'd seen the Cowboys do it. I don't know why we did that, do you? And took a hit off of it, and I passed it around the car. And then the next time it came around, I tipped it up, and I kept it there until the guys took it away from me. And I got a hold of a bunch of whiskey real fast, and everything changed. And I mean, it was great. I no longer felt like I didn't belong with that group in that car. I felt like I owned that group in that car. God, it was great. I could talk to the girls. Man. One of the girls in there had a couple of points about her that just fascinated the hell out of me. And I made a clumsy grab for her, and she liked to beat me to death. A little while later, they were going to sober me up. So they took me up to the Diamond Horseshoe truck stop, going to fill me full of coffee, and the coffee woke me up. It didn't sober me up. And I took a poke at a cowboy there, and he damn near did beat me to death. And I almost had the ideal weekend for a drunken young kid in Wyoming. I don't normally tell this from the podium, but it's true. I mean, it was that close. I'll get back to the story. But generally, when you were a young kid, like I was, in the group I was running with, and in my mind, the only thing to have a very successful evening would be is you're going to go out and get in a drunk, you're going to go out and get in a fight, you're going to go out and get laid. Not necessarily in that order. But generally the first 2 precluded the third, and nothing ever really happened other than get the crap beat out of me, and that'd be about it. And but anyway, they took me somewhere and they put me to bed, and I'm repeating this story back to you because it was told to me by both guys and one girl. That one girl I also threw up on her on the way back. I forgot about that. And that's as good as it ever got for me. That's the sum story of my social drinking. So I figure I crossed over that invisible line the day I was born. And that's it. I believe I came by this disease, a dishonest disease, as honestly as you can. It just kind of happened to me. And so, like I say, I drank from the time I was 16 till a month before my 25th birthday. And from that time, I went from a fairly healthy athletic type young fellow, but was reasonably bright and doing all it, and then just about told him I just destroyed myself during that time. I'm 130 pounds and I'm dying, and they're locking me up because they're not sure what's going to happen to me. We talk about that. We see things like that today. It was pretty uncommon back then. But I only drank whiskey and beer. I never used any other kind of drugs. That makes me kind of a dinosaur in AA now. They keep a few of them like me around just to show you that there are some. I only share that with you because most of my friends in AA and most of the people I know in AA are alcoholics who also use other drugs. But I didn't happen to be one. Because booze worked. God, it worked just great. And it did everything I ever wanted. There was a period of time in there where I would feel like I was what I wanted to be. Fleeting, yeah, and it never lasted long. In fact, shortly after that, I'd go out and I would drink. And I was generally waking up sick, and I was sitting down waiting for the bars to open in Cheyenne. And I was too young to have a driver's license. I was too young to be of age to buy whiskey and all that. And I'm sitting there waiting at the doors to get into the bars. And some of the guys that feel sorry for me sometimes, they'd bring some out to me and tell me to get the hell out of there. They didn't want me around. But then I would try to drink enough to catch my edge. You know what I mean? You'd get out there and you start drinking, and I remembered that neat spot that night. And I'm going to hit that. Somehow it's going to get there. And so I'd take my first drink, and I'd feel maybe 10% better, The sickness would be down a little bit, and the hole in my belly with the wind blowing through it would have died down maybe 10%, and I'd feel a little better. And then I'd take another drink, and I'd feel just a little bit better, and a couple more. And I'm thinking, one more drink, I'm going to be there. One more drink, and I'm going to catch my edge, and everything's going to be just right. And so I'd probably write them another bad check, and I'd get that one more drink, and damn, I blew right by it. Boom. And it was gone. I was off and running. I was fighting again and going to jail and again and all that sort of thing. It was crazy. And that's as good as it ever got. It was just that way for me, and it happened fast. I had met a girl I was a junior in high school, and she was a sophomore, and her name is Julie. And she's the first girl I ever became able to talk to, and so I kept her. And I'm always careful about how to tell this. You got to know that she had to be awful sick to hang around me anytime I get that done. Anyway, she basically was the only girl I ever dated in high school. And I, of course, graduated a year before she did, and I went into the Army for 6 months in a court-martial and came back. And my social drinking worked real well in the Army, too. And I called the school the day I got back out of the Army, and she was in there going to school, and I pretended to be her dad. And so she came out and met me at one of the side doors, and I drove off before they could see who it was that had picked her up. And we were gone, and we got married in August of that same year, and on January 1st of the following year, we had an 8.5-pound premature baby girl. Some of you are a little slow. I thought... You didn't tell me that about Buffalo Bill. I thought that... And we promptly started having kids and all that. Just very briefly, and I don't like to spend a whole lot of time in the drunk. What you really need to understand about me, I guess, is I know I'm a real alcoholic. And the reason I know that is any time I wanted not to drink, I drank. And once I drank, there wasn't anything I could do with it. I couldn't do a thing about it. I couldn't do nothing about it. And so at age 24, I hit that nut house, and I'm dying. And Julie's at home with 3 little girls. Her dad's boarding up a house because they're going to foreclose on it. And and she had to go in and move and live with neighbors while they locked me up in that nut house. I was in there for 4 months, for 16 weeks. It was not a 30-day spin dry. Wasn't necessarily a treatment for alcoholism either, but what I learned in there, I guess, I learned I was an alcoholic. And there was incidentally, I never tell this part much. The man that ran that program at the university, the Wyoming State Hospital, was a fellow named Sam Wilson, and he was not any relation to Bill at all. But he had the idea that maybe if he could get a drunk dried out long enough and get him exposed to Alcoholics Anonymous, there might be a chance that they would get sober. And so somehow he got a hold of some state money, and they let him put this program into the nut house at that point in time, because before that all they did was lock you up and dry you out and keep you there for a month for free labor, because this thing was self-sustaining. It had its own dairy operation, and it really was. So they had the drunks out milking cows and shoveling stuff. And that's what they did. And so after he came in, they kept us for 16 weeks milking cows and shoveling stuff. But we would go to, they would force us to go to an AA meeting. I came in and it was a program of attraction, and I was really attracted to it, because if I hadn't gone to them damn meetings, it had me change wards. And I didn't want to go to that other ward. It didn't look pleasant at all. And so I learned I was an alcoholic there because they told me, and they showed me the old U-shaped Jellinek charts. Remember those? You got all the different symptoms going down it, and then there's this mess at the bottom of DTs, and more of the same, and then you come back out and they're showing different stages of recovery. And of course I'm sitting there kind of checking them off as I go down it, and I get down to that mess at the bottom, and I thought, I must be one. And it really was that simple. I didn't have any difficulty with that. In fact, it was kind of nice to know what I was. I hadn't had a clue with that. All I knew was I had the wart on my nose, and nobody else was like me. Nobody else was as bad as me or as dirty as me. Nobody else out there beat on their wife and their children and wrote bad checks for a living. And so, a nut house is probably a pretty good place for me, and I really believe that. I learned in there that I might be able to live the rest of my life and not drink. And I learned in there that would probably be in an outfit called Alcoholics Anonymous. And one of these cowboys that had driven up from Salt Lake City to help put on the meetings in that nut house came up to me, and he kind of explained that to me. I suffered then, don't now, but I suffered then from a great deal of arrogance. And it worked well. It kept people away from me pretty well. But he kind of came up to me, and he just made it real simple. He said, I seen you when you first hit the door here. I was up here hauling a friend out that day you came in here. And he says, I saw you walk up the stairs. He says, I can't believe that you've recovered that much already. From the time I came in at 130 pounds to literally about 2 months later, I had gained like 40 pounds or so. I was up 175 and 80 and all that. I liked real food. I didn't know that. So anyway, he kind of explained to me that AA would probably be a place that I could live the rest of my life. And the way I'm talking about living is breathing in and out. There's nothing more. There's nothing more to it than that. Because I really fully understood that I was dying. And that I was lucky to have got there. And so when they talked about not taking the first drink, you won't get drunk, I heard them. And I did that. I believed that. Now looking back on it today, it was given the gift. I don't remember a single day that I fought from that time on where I was fighting booze. It never happened for me. I've been sober since that day, and I don't remember ever fighting a split. I've had a couple occasions after I got involved in the steps where I get the flashes in the book talks about, like when the desire to drink returns. They would hit me, but it was never really a fight. I drove right past the place I saw or the sign I saw or whoever it was that would prompt that to me, and I would get home or I'd get to the meeting and I'd call somebody I knew in AA and say, guess what happened to me? And I still do that because the last time it happened to me was about 1.5 years ago. And I got home and you're sober 30 years and all that, and you really want to come tell somebody, you know, you're still R1. I used to have a sponsor named Ralph. He's not my sponsor today. But he used to say something that just drive me crazy because I was sure I was growing up and I was going to be the next Chuck Chamberlain in AA and a real spiritual giant. And Ralph used to tell me, he says, no, Gary, he says, it's not the last drink that you really need to be concerning yourself with. It's how close you are to your next drink that you probably ought to be dealing with. And I used to hate it when he said that. In fact, that still kind of ticks me off when I say it. I never really liked that. And so when I left there, 4 months later, they put me on a Greyhound bus back to Cheyenne. That's about a 400-mile ride. And I was on the loose. I was physically had my health back. I'd told some people a couple of things I thought they wanted to hear, and it worked. And so I kind of had a little plan for me when I got out of that nut house. What they'd done is they'd come up to me while I was in there, you know, a couple of weeks before I'm due to get out. And they said, Gary, they said, you know, there's a deal here where you could sign up for it, and we'll send you to college. We'll pay you enough money to maintain your wife and your family, buy all your books and tuition at school. Do you think you'd want to do that? Well, just before that, they'd be talking about where I was going to go find a job. What would you have done? Huh? So I had a plan when I got out of it. And I got on this bus, and I'll never forget it because I felt pretty good. Physically, I was really pretty much together. I'd been working hard that whole time. I'd been playing a lot of basketball. I was in shape. And Julie said she thought she was glad to have me home. And that's true. That's exactly how it was. We had a little girl at home that I didn't remember seeing. I knew she was there because they told me about it after the nut house. But she had been born in August of that year, and I'd gone in the nut house in December. And I really didn't remember Tracy, other than what they'd told me. And so she was there with her 2 older sisters and that. And so I was going home looking at that. And at that point in time, Julie and the kids were living with her folks. And I was going to be real glad to see them. And I got on that bus, and I hadn't been on that puppy 30 minutes. I'm sitting there, and the hole in my belly and the wind blowing through it is back. And I'm just as scared, and I'm just as uncomfortable as I'd been in my life. Now, you understand what had happened is I've been locked up in there for 4 months. I've been dried out. I've been to AA for 4 months, the 2 or 3 meetings a week, whatever it was, plus some of the other deals they had us doing, and I was still suffering from untreated alcoholism. And effectively, I spent the next 4 years truly suffering from untreated alcoholism. And just briefly put, and to get this out of the way, I got out of the nut house. I went to college for 3 years. 3 years in the summer. You're sick as I was, you don't dare take a vacation. And so I went right through it. I attended AA in Laramie. They had an AA meeting down there on Monday night, and then they had one on Friday night if somebody else showed up. So my first acquaintance with AA was a small number of drunks in Laramie, and one fella that I had a short time between getting out of the nut house and going over to Laramie to go to school, where I had to stay in Cheyenne there, and an AA member came by and got me. Never heard this monkey before. He just called my in-laws' house, and he said, "What are you doing tonight?" And I said, "Oh, nothing." He says, "I'm going to be there in 10 minutes. Be ready to go." And it was too late to think up something, so I went with him. And we went down to the jail, and we fished this guy out of jail. His name's Phil. Down there. And I looked up the top of the stairs. I didn't know who we were going to get, but they had, the holding pins. Some of you guys have been there know what I'm talking about. And right at the top of the stairs, you could walk in and look up and sit there, and they had this guy sitting out there. And I realized it was a guy I'd known in high school who, he's just pretty sorry sort of a guy. In fact, I really didn't think I wanted to be associated with him. And And he's sitting up there in that holding pen looking out in the street, and he's not sure he wants to go with me. And anyway, we ended up getting him, and we took him to an AA meeting. And at that point in time, Phil had never been to an AA meeting. They just didn't know what else to do with him. He was a heroin addict. And they just didn't know. And somehow these drunks said, well, let's try and get into an AA meeting. It was long before this shit's fashionable, you understand. And he's the only guy close to my age in AA in southeast Wyoming at that time. And so he and I kind of teamed up. He ended up getting out of school and getting out of jail and jumping on the same free ride to school I did and moved over to Laramie. So my first 3.5 years in AA, if you will, sober, are spent staying extremely busy, working a job, going to school, and doing everything I can do to keep from being by myself, not doing anything, because I can't stand that. Because the hole in my belly and the wind blowing through it and the pain and the fear is just too much. It's just driving me crazy. And I go to AA meetings there, and they would tell me things like, going to an AA meeting was like paying your insurance premium. I still don't understand that. I don't know why the hell I'm even talking about that. Nobody mentioned the big book. Nobody mentioned the 12 steps or anything else. There was one, I take that back. Old Frank was there. He used to come to that meeting for a day. He was the guy who'd been in and out a long time. He came in one time and says, well, I got it handled this time. He says, I know why. He says, I took the third step this time and everything's going just fine. He says, I know that's it. The answer's the third step. And the next Saturday, old Frank came down drunk, and I said, I ain't screwing to that third step. So I made up my own program. And I got myself a 12 and 12, and a Hazelden guide, and a little red book. And old Lois, she thought I ought to have a Bible. I went about and I started to make up my own program. And the pain got worse and I got sicker. And sicker and sicker, and going to meetings and doing that. And I moved to Denver, and I got a job down there, and I moved to Denver, and I started attending some meetings down on the south side in Inglewood. And there was a little difference. There were more people in there talking about things like going to meetings was paying your insurance premium. Some of them would come up to me and pat me on the back and say, gee, isn't it great you got a hold of this thing so young? You didn't have to go through what we went through to get here. And I'd think, geez, I just finished damn near dying out there. There really isn't a whole lot left for me to do. I won't make it if I go back out. I know that. It used to really upset me. Now, I guess they had the right thing in their heart when they would do that, but it still kind of ticks me off. I'd been dying and I knew it. There wasn't any place else for me to go. I didn't come here because I wanted to. You guys cleaned up real good tonight, but you ought to see yourselves on normal nights. I really didn't. This wasn't what I wanted to be. It meant I had to be around other people, and I had to learn to live with you, and I didn't like the idea of that. So I ended up down there, and through a crazy circumstance, I ran into a fellow named Joe there. And I don't think Joe goes to AA anymore, but he was closer to my age, and we were going to this meeting down in Inglewood, and after the meeting, he and I'd go out and have coffee and bitch about the meeting. And we thought, well, geez, they ought to do something different. They're always reading that first portion of the 5th chapter there and all that. They really need to change all these things, and that's what we did. Joel was really good at bitching. He had what I wanted. I wanted to be that good at that. And this one day, we're at his house sitting there drinking coffee and bitching, and his wife came in, and Janet said, you two are... I got to paraphrase this. She says, you two are the two sorriest people I know. Handled that pretty well. And she says, I don't even want to be around you. She says, I don't care what you do, just get the hell away from me. You can go out and get drunk. She says, I understand there's a young people's meeting down there on Skid Row somewhere in Denver. She said, why don't you go to do that? Just get away from me. I don't want anything to do with you. And she was serious. She really didn't care if we got it. And Joe got all puffed up. He says, well, come on, Brown, let's go down there. He says, the babes there got to be better looking anyway. And that's why we went. They were. But what happened was, we got in there, and there was a group of people in there I hadn't seen before. Not one of those pups came up to me and patted me on the back and said, "Gee, isn't it wonderful you came in here so young." Didn't have to go through what we went through to get here. And they didn't look like the kind of people I should socialize with at all. The book says that we are a group of people normally who would not mix, right? Boy, that was true. And so anyway, I started attending this group because there was something different about that. I was sober longer than most of them, coming in at 4 years sober about, and even of the pain, but I thought that gave me a license to pull rank on them. And so you laugh like you've been there. I don't. And I remember we would start talking things about the steps. And these guys were talking about doing the steps and reading the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And nobody had ever said that to me. But if they had, my listener wasn't working real good. And so I was listening to what they're talking about. I thought, geez, what are they doing? There's 12 steps up there. Just reach up and grab one. What the hell? It doesn't make any difference. And I remember reporting that back to a lady, an old-timer in AA in Cheyenne, who I knew briefly. And I was telling her about these people talking about these steps and all of that. And she says, "Gary, you mean you haven't figured that out yet?" And I said, "What's that?" And she says, "They put numbers in front of those steps so dumb bastards like you know which one to take next." She said she thought I ought to go back down there and get back involved with that group. So anyway, what we did was, one night, a bunch of them there decided that they wanted to have a big book study. At that point in time, the Denver Young People's Group had a closed meeting downtown on the Skids, and they had an open meeting on Sunday nights up at the old York Street Club. And at that point in time, it was probably the biggest meeting in the city. I think people came in there because they just wanted to see who was going to come in next, because we're talking late 60s and the time of the hippies, and it was crazy what was going on down there, but that was the meeting. And so we decided to start a third group, and we were going to read the big book. And to this day, you got to understand, we went into this not having a clue what we were doing. There was not an old-timer there. There was not a guru to take us through it. And that's one of the miracles of this deal, I think. But so any of us, 14 ended up doing this. We had to go from home to home. We didn't have a place or the money to rent a place. Then, so, one night we would be up in one of the uptown apartments with one of the young businessmen in the group, and the next night we'd be out in Goat Hill and Lee's place, in different parts of town, and holding our meetings and going from. But to this day, it just amazes me. We took our big book out, and we opened it up just inside the flyleaf, and we read that and talked about it. We started at the beginning of the book. That may not bother you, that just amazes the hell out of me. And we started going through the book, and we would read a little bit, and somebody invariably would interrupt the reading, maybe even read themselves, and share something about what they thought it meant, or something that had happened that day with what it was, or how they thought they were going to do it. And so we ended up going through the book effectively one line at a time, sometimes one statement at a time, and if that suggested we do something, we did it. If it asked us a question, we answered it. And that's just kind of what we started to do. I remember any number of times I'd start to say something, well, the way I interpret that. And little Lee would say, "Gary, we don't much care how you interpret that. We're only interested in the black print on the white page." And they said that to me often. In the meantime, my life is deteriorating. I had a degree in accounting, and I went to work for a big oil company, and they had this funny attitude. They thought their accountants, these guys in there, they were counting their money and all that, ought to be able to look them in the eye. And I couldn't do that. I literally was too terrified to do it. I couldn't even sit in conversation over coffee and look you in the eye and talk to you. I was that afraid. If you were talking to me, it was worse than if I were talking to you, but you knew I was afraid, and I knew you knew. You had to see it. You just had to know it was there. And so my life at home is getting home. I'm doing anything I can do to keep from being by myself. I'm running to meetings. Meetings. What I was learning is that meetings, and not drinking don't work. I was still suffering from untreated alcoholism. And so I went back to the meeting on that, and we started reading the big book, and some things started to change a little bit, and I was learning stuff I hadn't picked up before. I learned why I drank. I always thought it was because of my dad's ticked-off attitude all the time, or my mother's switch, or the dog bites, or the fights. And it wasn't any of those. It didn't. I drank because I like what alcohol does for me. The doctor explained it to men and women drink because they like the effect produced by alcohol. It takes away all that other stuff, doesn't it? There is no cause and effect from my childhood to my alcoholism. It didn't happen that way. And so anyway, we got to reading in the book, and we got to the third chapter about it, more about alcoholism. And this book being a basic text, if you will, that's pretty much the first step discussion there. There's some more before that, but the bulk of it's there. And there's a line in there on the first page of it, or 3 or 4 lines, as a matter of fact, where it says, we learned we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics. This is the first step to recovery. The delusion we're anything like other people or presently may be has to be smashed. And we read that night, and somebody gave me the keys to the kingdom right there. And it really happened for me right then. And I don't know how to explain that. I had known all along that I'm powerless over alcohol. There's nothing I can do about booze, whether you're drinking it or I'm drinking or nobody's drinking. I'm powerless over it. Left to my own devices, I'll drink. Period. And I knew that. I knew that from day one. And for some reason that night when we read that, I picked up the first step in its entirety. You know? My life had indeed become unmanageable. Looking back on that, my life has never been unmanageable. Manageable, excuse me. There's never been a point in time when I could do anything about my life. And what I'm talking about is what goes on in here. Most of the time, even drunk, I could get up and go to work. It had nothing to do about me pulling up my boots and going out there and trying to put in a day's work. It had nothing to do with those kind of, it had to do with what I was feeling and thinking, because I couldn't do anything about either one of those. I was helpless. I'd be terrified. I made the mistake of telling my dad one time I was scared. I only did it once. Because he said, "Ah, shit, what are you scared of? You got nothing to be scared of." And I couldn't say, then why am I so terrified? What's this all about? Couldn't manage it. I couldn't do it. And so anyway, I left that meeting that night knowing that I had something going for me, and I didn't know what. But I was a part of something, and I could quit acting like I was something else. I know that now. I didn't know that. And I learned what my alcoholic insanity is. If the second step says I'll come to believe that the power greater than myself can restore me to sanity, then I needed to know what the insanity was. And I thought it was all that crazy stuff that I do when I'm drinking. I always thought it was that stuff of showing up in Mexico when I was supposed to be at work at Cheyenne at 8 o'clock in that morning. Or those kind of things, and that didn't have a thing to do with that. The true insanity of my disease is my inability to stay away at the first drink. That I can't do that. All the knowledge in the world would not keep me from taking that first drink. And I had those times, many times, where I'd wake up, I had 2 or 3 weeks sober. You know, the kids are coming back into the kitchen with me. The wife's about to invite me back into the bedroom. The dog even came back in the house. And I knew it was because of booze. I knew when I drank, stuff happened. And I knew, I just knew it. And the other thing is that don't drink. No matter what, don't drink. My neighbor came down the street. He was one of these guys that was always driving down Denver to the discount liquor store and coming back with a pickup full of beer. And he had a couple of coolers out in his garage. He was a great guy. And he came by and he says, "I just got a new truckload of beer in, Brown. Come on over." I said, "Be right there." And I'm over there drinking. There was no thought whatsoever that I was going back to jail, that I was losing the job, that I was going to be beating on Julie and the kids, and I was going to be doing all that stuff that I hated myself for. So I knew I was powerless over alcohol, and that's why I know today I'm a real alcoholic. I believe that I could be relieved of that by going to AA meetings, and I really did. I watch a lot sicker people than I get well in AA, in my mind. I mean, I saw some really sick pups come into that young people's group, and they grew right past me. Their lives changed right in front of me. And they'd come in, and all of a sudden they were starting to get things straightened out. Maybe they were paying their child support. Maybe they were getting the family together, holding jobs. And they were doing things real men were supposed to do, and I still couldn't do that. I'm 4 years sober. I'm still intentionally writing bad checks. I quit throwing punches, both with Julie and the kids, or particularly with anybody that was big enough to hit back. And that had changed. But I came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity when I watched other drunks come into AA and their lives came together. And you know, some things happened about that during that time. It was great. One guy came into the group then, his name's Tom. And Tom had come into AA, and he was telling us, at that time he was maybe 24 or 25. And he was telling us about the time that he was going to recover from alcoholism by going to a hospital there, and I can't recall the name of it, but the treatment was the old diversion treatment. I know you remember that, because what they did, the diversion treatment went like this, for those who aren't, it's a medieval treatment, and it's still around the country in certain places. But the treatment was in a hospital setting, and it's a square room, maybe 12 foot square. The walls in the room are mirrored, and there's shelves attached to these mirrors, all kinds of liquor on the shelves. In the middle of the room, there's a barber chair and a big stainless steel pot that swivels in front of or away from who's ever in that chair. And they gave him some Antabuse, and they sat him in there, and they said, you can have anything there on the wall you choose to drink. And so, of course, what happens is the patient at that point in time drinks on top of the Antabuse, gets violently ill, you know, watches himself in the mirror as his hair falls out and his eyes cross and his toenails curl, and he throws everything up that he's eaten in the last 20 years. And the whole idea of this deal is after it's over, he's going to be so adverse to drinking, he'll just never take another drink. And Tom came to us and he said, you know, he said that worked. He said it really did, that he had not had reason or excuse to take Antabuse since. Anyway, we went on and we read more in the book, and we got into the 5th chapter and we got into the 3rd step, and I won't do it in a great deal of detail here. Joe's already done that for you, but what happened is we got to reading about the actor, and we got right down to the prayer. And little Lee stopped us again. He says, I got an idea. He said, I would like for all of us to hold hands and read/pray that 3rd step prayer together. And he says, the reason I want to do that is I'm nearly 4 years sober now. And I go to a lot of meetings, and I see an awful lot of people come in and go out of AA, and I talk to people about what they're doing with the step. And he says, I'll ask somebody why they haven't taken their 4th-step inventory yet, and he says, you know, they'll tell me it's because they've not taken the 3rd step. He says, well, that's kind of where I'm at. He says, so I figure if we all stand up and do this 3rd step prayer together, that if you catch me out there 2 weeks from now telling somebody I can't write an inventory because I haven't taken the 3rd step yet, you can call me a damn liar because you saw me do it. And that, even to me, that kind of made sense. And you have to understand that back there in the late 60s, it really wasn't cool for a room full of boys to stand around and hold hands and in my mind, pray. I mean, God forbid somebody see you do that. But we did. And some more happened to me. I don't know how important that sounds to you, but that's a real significant part of my life. And some of the people that Joe and Janice have been around back there in Denver are there because of that night. Because what happened, there were 14 of us that started out in that group, and 13 of us are still alive in AA. Now, that was back in the late 60s. And I about defy you to go to any group anywhere and find that kind of longevity remaining out of 14 original people that made it. We're scattered out around the country pretty well, but a good portion of us are still in Denver. And many of us are taking people through the steps like I'm talking about this first experience I had. And it's work. I just still can't get over that. It just blows me away when I think about those guys that we ended up doing that. I left there that night knowing I really had something going for me. I'd never had that experience in my life. My religious training as a child was such that I learned the Lord's Prayer in AA meetings. I didn't know it before I got here. That's a little tricky when you come in and everybody wants to stand up and say the Lord's Prayer to you, because you really don't want anybody to know you don't know it. And so you got to mumble your way through it just to fool. The first two words you got. And the last one you got. But I hadn't had the background. And my life changed. I really felt like I had some momentum there, that this thing was going to work. And maybe some of that pain was going away, and maybe my life would straighten out. And it didn't matter. At that point in time, we were reading in the 5th chapter about inventory, and every meeting I went to seemed to be a discussion on inventory, and I was trapped. And one of the guys in the group, a fellow named Ernie, had disappeared for a while. And keep in mind the sign of the times, we're still back in the time of the hippies and the peace sign and all of that. And Ernie had disappeared. Now, Ernie and I really didn't like each other. Now, in AA, we love everybody, right? I mean, we don't go around saying that guy over there is a real jerk. I mean, you just don't do it. Joe, we don't do that. But he and I really didn't like each other, and that was kind of the sign of the raging that he and I both had. And he disappeared. And I go down to young people's for a meeting. Somebody say, "Where's Ernie?" And I say, "Don't knock it. He's gone. Just leave him out." And I meant it. I was stone serious. But we used to go into a meeting, and because you didn't want anybody to know that you didn't love them and all that, you'd give everybody the peace sign. Remember, it was the late 60s and this peace sign? And I'd hug people, and I'd give other people across the room peace sign. I'd give it to Ernie over there, and he'd give it back to me, and he's missing this finger. That's only partly why I didn't like him. But he came back, and he'd been gone for a while, and I watched Ernie come in the room, and there was something completely different about him. He had changed, and I didn't know what it was, but I looked him in the eye when he came in, and there was somebody home. And there hadn't been anybody there before. And I'm serious. You could see it. It's just crazy. And so he got in there. He got to telling the story that he had gotten into a beef at home, and he'd run away from home, and he'd gone down to Lake Whitney, Texas, and got around to some AAs down there, and that fellow Bob White I was talking about. And they locked him in a motel room down there and gave him a pad and a pencil and a big book and told him to write an inventory. So a couple of days later, he came out of there, and Bob White says, "Would you like to go out in the middle of the lake and go fishing?" And Ernie loves to fish. I mean, he just loves to fish. And so Bob gets him out in the middle of that lake in that big boat, and he turns the boat off, puts the keys in his pocket, and he says, "Ernie, why don't you tell me what's in that inventory?" And Martinez can't swim. So he took a fifth step. And so he came back to Denver, and he'd changed. There was somebody home, and I hadn't seen anybody there before. And so I knew there was something there that I had to do. And that night, I went home, and I got my big book out, and a pad and pencil, and I went in on the kitchen table, and I wrote inventory. And I wrote all night, and I did the best I could with the training I had. And I tried to do as much as the book said. And I did it. And I quit about sunup, and I quit because there didn't seem to be any more to write. And I hung on to that inventory for a while. And Ernie found out that I had it. And he starts leaning on me to take a fifth step. Well, what's he know? And so I dodged him for a while. And we heard about a little AA conference that was going to come up in southeast Colorado. A town called Lamar. And 4 of us are going to go down there, and we left late this one day, and we got lost. You can't hardly get lost going from Denver to Lamar, but we did. There's only one turn, and we missed it. And so we got there. There's only 2 motel rooms left, which means you got to take on a roommate. And I had high hopes that Mary was going to be my roommate, but I get Ernie. And so he really started leaning on me to take a fifth step there, and he says, "You're crazy if you don't." He says, "There's a lot of old sobriety here, and there's many of people that have listened to this, and they know what the step work is about. You're crazy if you don't do it. And I looked around that conference. There wasn't anybody there I liked any better than him, so I took my first fifth step with him. And later on, I did steps 6 and 7, and I got started on my amends. But from that point on, I pulled my punch for many years, and I didn't get any further. And I spent a lot of time over the years, for the next 15 years, as a matter of fact, traveling around the country and teaching people how to work steps. And going to a lot of meetings. I moved from Denver to Indianapolis, which was a sure sign I'd missed the second step somewhere. God, they love it in Indianapolis when I say that. I'd run there and ended up there in an entirely different setting from when you grow up with cowboys in the Rockies and mountains and men up in the cornfields in Indiana. Things are a little bit different, and AA was different. And in fact, we went to our first meeting. It's an old group there in Indianapolis, and at that point in time, this would have been 1977. We went there, and we went to the speaker meeting this one night, and again, we'd been out west. And Julie and I were sitting there, and this fella we'd met, named Al, was chairing the meeting. And he got up and he introduced himself. He says, "Hi, everybody, my name is Al, and I'm an alcoholic." And Julie and I hollered, "Hi, Al." And the whole damn group turned around and looked at us. And at the end of the meeting, we reached over to grab hands to say the Lord's Prayer. You should have seen them. It was just, they didn't want to do that. And I ended up in Denver, and I ended up sharing my experience. When you're the new guy in town, you get to go to all the speaker meetings in town and speak, and you're hot for a while. And so I was traveling all over the Indianapolis area telling my story and sharing my experience with the steps up to this point. And it took 4 years when I was finally able to get a group to start to go through that same deal with me. And so in 1980, 14 of us sat down and we went through it, and 13 of us finished. I didn't tell you about the 14th guy in Denver. He went out and died an alcoholic death. He froze to death. And he'd gone out and done it. And the 14 we started with in Indianapolis, that guy went out, and I don't know what happened to him. I never heard of him again. But 13 of us finished it there. And then what happened in Indianapolis was these guys went out in 2s, 3s, and 4s and did workshops with other people. They were smart enough to start calling it workshops. That had never struck me. And that's what they did. And so this process started in 1980, and I would guess today you could probably go around to any side. Indianapolis metro area is probably the same size as it is around here, 1.5 million people, something like that. And you could probably go around that area today, and I'd be surprised if you wouldn't find 8 or 10 big book, 12-step workshops going on. And they do that, and it's because they put me there, and I was terrified, and I was lying about the steps, and we were doing that. It was going. 10 years ago, I'm in trouble. I'm in serious trouble. I've been doing things I shouldn't have been doing, in and out of AA, and I couldn't make a living anymore. I was in real trouble financially. And I called this guy in Chicago that I'd known of for a long time. In fact, I'd known him for many years and had a great deal of respect for him. And he's one of the original people in AA, and who had spent, not only just knew Bill Wilson, had spent a great deal of time with him and all that. And so I called him. And so I said, "Paul," this is Gary Brown. I said, "I got a question for you." I said, "Do you think there's any possibility a 45-year-old alcoholic grandfather with 20 years of sobriety could be going through male menopause?" And he said, "Well, maybe." He says, "But I think if you go through the steps, take another inventory, come up and sing some 5th steps and make some amends, you're going to feel better." And I said, "I think I'll do whatever you need to do." He says, "Start writing." And so I wrote inventory again. Now keep in mind, I'd been doing that at least once a year in these workshops all this time. I'd write inventory, get up to step 7, and quit. Time and time again. Now what happens to you if you're sober in AA and that's all you do with the step is you get on this yo-yo. And you're up and down and you're up and down, and you think writing 4th and 5th steps is going to fix it. And you're writing 4th and 5th steps over the same old stuff because it hadn't got fixed. You haven't followed the directions. You haven't done it. And at this time, I'm at the low part of the yo-yo, and it's been lower at every part I'd ever been. And so when I wrote this inventory this time, I wrote a good one. And you know what? I covered very little old ground. There wasn't much on there that had been on previous inventory, except for the sex inventory, and I figured it needed an overhaul. And I called him a week or so later, and I said, I'm done. And he says, we'll be up here Friday. And he gave me the name of a motel on Ogden Avenue and told me to be there by 4 o'clock, and so I did. I got there just early enough to go get me a cup of coffee at this restaurant, and I got back to my room, and I shut the door, and there's a knock on the door. And this guy, I opened the door, and this guy says, hi, Gary. He says, my name's Dennis O'Brien. I'm 29 years sober, and I'm here to swap fifth steps with you. I'll go first so you'll know what to do. And this little geezer comes in, opens up a 3-ring binder, and sits down, and starts reading inventory to me. And I'm looking at mine because he had copied. There was similar stuff there, real similar. The names were different. That's a good thing. Just thought of that. And it didn't take us long. We were both old-timers in A, and we'd written a lot of inventory, so we'd gotten away from all the drama. And we were down to the resentment, what it was about, how it affected us, and where we had fallen in a hurry. And we went through those quick, and we talked about our fears and our sexual behavior, and we compared notes, and I picked up some stuff I'd missed. He picked up some stuff he missed, and he left. And I went down to this restaurant, and I got me another cup of coffee, and I go back to my room, and there's a knock on the door, and this guy's out the door, and he says, my name's Chuck, I'm an alcoholic. I'm 20 years sober, and I'm here to swap fifth steps with you. I'll go first so you know what to do. By Sunday noon, we'd done that 9 times with 9 different guys. From a guy 38 years sober down to a guy 3 or 4 years sober. Now, when you're a spiritual giant at 20 years, having a guy 3 or 4 years sober telling you how to work steps is a real thrill. And I met Paul and the guys for lunch at noon on Sunday. And they said, well, Gary, did you do 6 and 7 before you came over? And I said, yeah. And they said, well, get your pad and pencil out. We'll start on your men's list now. And these guys had one hell of a memory. Because they were helping me. Well, what about so-and-so? What about your father-in-law? And so we put together the amends list, and I still carry the biggest part of it here with me. And because they're all crossed off, and I look at it and gloat. And so that was my instruction. Was if you don't want to die, you're going to have to do that. And I believe I would have. I believe I was as sicker then as I had been 20 years before that first came in. I'd been effectively suffering from untreated alcoholism. I'd find ways to ease the pain temporarily, but it always came back. Always. And so I went home and sat down with Julie, and we went over the men's list together, and we owed thousands and thousands of dollars. We didn't owe it for anything, we just owed it. I mean, there was not new furniture, new houses, new cars, new stuff like that. It was just all this money accumulated up over the years, drunk and sober. And so where you start with that is you finally start calling these people and making these amends and getting going with them. So I'm making deals with people. I'll just tell you about 2 or 3 of these calls real quickly. One of them was to a man named John, who had hired me while I was going to school there in Laramie. I needed a part-time job, and he thought I was trustworthy, and he hired me to work in his men's clothing store there. And because he trusted me, he would leave me alone to manage it. And as a result of that, I left Laramie as the best-dressed graduating senior to ever come out of there, and I hadn't paid for any of those clothes. And so I called John, and I all these years later, and I said, hey, this is Gary Brown. Do you remember me? He says, yeah. He says, you used to work for me. And I said, that's right. He said, do you still go to them meetings? And I says, well, yeah. I said, that's why I'm calling. And so I told him that as best as I could tell, I'd stolen all this clothing from him, and I figured I owed him so much money, and I was calling to start making arrangements to pay it back. So we settled on $50 a month. And I wrote him a check, and I sent him off, and I wrote him a check the next month, and then the next month, and then I missed a month. I didn't get a commission check, and I didn't pay him, and he called me. And he said, "Where's my check?" And I said, "I'll get it to you." I said, "I just didn't get a commission check this time." I said, "I'm still going to get this done. I got to." He says, "Nah, you don't either." He says, "Not in my case." He says, "I don't need the money, and I don't want it." He says, "I just love what you're doing, and I'm so proud of you for doing it." Da-da-da-da-da. And he forgave me. And so we called Julie's folks. We had taken I had taken much money from them. I would even sign notes promising to pay it back, and of course I never would, and they would never press us. All this money I'm talking about, nobody was billing me for, you need to understand. This is the stuff that accumulated over the years. I did not have bill collectors knocking my door down. And so anyway, I called there on this Tuesday night, and Julie's dad answered the phone. And I made amends to him as much as I could. And what I said was, I says, "You know, I don't know just how to go about this, but I owe you a great deal for the love and the tolerance you've shown me over the years, because I know what I put you through. I know the pain you had to go through and the way you saw me treating your daughter and your granddaughters. You had to know that that was awful. And I know that's awful, and I don't know how I can ever pay you back for that. But somehow, some way, you let me know what I need to do, and I'll do it." And I said, "I really love you." And he said, "Oh, shit," and he handed the phone to Grandma. And so I go through the same deal with her. And I get down to the end and all that. I said, "By the way, have you any idea how much money you've given us over the last 26 years? And she said, "Right down to the last penny." And so we made arrangements to start paying that back. And so, interestingly enough, that was on a Tuesday night. The following Thursday night, Julie's dad was out trying out his new snowblower, and he fell over with a heart attack and never regained consciousness. I just made it. Wouldn't that have been a shame to miss that one? Huh? What would you do? So anyway, we plugged away at this for several years, 4 or 5 years, and we're sending the money out, and it's just getting so discouraging because, all the money I could possibly earn, all it was token payments to these people. And I remember sitting there this one night, and I said, "Julie, we're never going to get through this. I mean, how are we going to do that?" And that was a serious mistake, because Julie says, "I got an idea." She says, "We've lived in this house now for the last 10, 11 years. She said, we've got some equity in it. And she says, do you think maybe we could sell a house, and there might be enough left out of that we could take care of all these old amends, and maybe we could buy an old used mobile home or something, and we could live in there?" And I said, "Yeah, right. Think about that. That's heavy stuff." And I really hoped she wasn't serious, but I knew she was. And so the next night I got home and I said, "Let's call Paul and see what he says." And so I did. I called him and I said, "Over the last 20 years, you've been real quick to tell me when I'm loco. I said, try this on for size." So I explained to him about selling the house and buying a trailer house. I says, "How crazy does that sound?" And he's Gary. He says, "I've known you 20 years, and that's the sanest thing I've ever heard you say." He said, "Was it your idea?" And I said, "No, it was Julie," and he said he thought so. The house wasn't enough. I had to cash in all the retirement and all our savings. I cashed in the 401ks, every possible way I could come up with. We sold the house. And we had enough left afterwards to buy the used trailer house. But meantime, that day we bought the trailer house and got all that other stuff was the greatest day of our lives. And you need to know that. You really need to know that. I wish there was some way I could express to you to sell you on the idea of doing this, but unfortunately you're going to have to experience yourself. Ain't that a bitch? I started calling people and getting addresses. I called John in Laramie, and all I said was, "John, what's your address? I'm ready to pay your money." And he gave it to me. He forgot he forgave me. And we called and set it up with her mother, and we're taking care of all that. And I'm running a little bit over, but I promised to stop before the dance starts. I'll be up here talking. You guys just going two-stepping past here, I can tell right now. And there'd been a guy in AA and a guy in the circuit who does a lot of talking and lives up in Minnesota, who used to make a ton of money. I mean, he was one of these people that could literally make money faster than he could spend. And he and I had gotten to love each other over the years. We really love each other today. We're good friends. We disagree at just about everything in the program, but we really love each other. And he had called me long before we sold the house and did all that, and said, listen, he says, I'm going to be giving a talk down in Virginia this coming weekend, and I got some extra time. He says, I thought I'd leave a day early and stop off in Indianapolis and spend the day with you and Julie in the night and then go on down. I said, gee, that'd be great. I'd love to see you. And so I meet him at the airport. And before we leave the airport, we decided he wanted to stop and have a cup of coffee and visit before we got in the car. And so we're sitting there talking, and he looked me in the eye. That was a mistake. I probably shouldn't have looked at him. And he said, you look terrible. I paraphrased that again. And he said, what's going on? And I said, Bob, they're going to foreclose on the house tomorrow. And I said, I've been spending the money in the wrong places and got terribly far behind on the house payments, and they're going to foreclose. I said, that's bad enough. The bad part is Julie doesn't know that. I've never told her. And in fact, I've not told anybody else in AA, and I had my guys there in AA that I hadn't told. Patty here knows one of them pretty well. He's the closest friend I have there. And I hadn't even told her. And so just telling him, God, what a relief. Just saying something to him. And so anyway, we're driving on out to the house, and we're taking the interstate through Indy. And he said, hey, where's your bank? And I said, what bank? He says, the one that has a note on your house. I said, oh, that's right downtown here. I said, why? He says, let's go in there and see if they'll talk. I said, Bob, they're all done talking. They ain't interested in talk. He said, oh, you never know. Let's go see. And so we went up there, and I park across the street, and we're walking into that bank. I'll tell you what that was like. Have any of you guys ever had to go into the school to see the principal with your dad? Because that's what it felt like. And we walked in there, and we sat down, and he says, what's it going to take to get Gary caught up? And they gave him the number, and he's carrying it in cash and traveler's checks. And he laid it up there, and I walked out of there, and you think I felt silly going in there. You should have been in my skin coming out of there. And I said, damn. I said, I got to pay that back. And he said, that's your problem. And it really was. So anyway, I called him after we'd sold the house on that day, that greatest day of our life. And I said, give me your address, Bob. I'm going to send you the money you gave me. And he laughed. And I said, what's so damn funny? He says, well, the story is this. He says, the law has changed here, and you can no longer do limited partnerships in real estate for the tax deal. And he says, I don't make anywhere close to the money I used to make. It's the first time since I've been sober I'm actually on an allowance. He says, I got investors wanting their money, and he says, I'm in serious trouble financially. And he says, but you need to understand, when I was making all that money, Linda and I would decide what we were going to do for a tithe. And so we're churchgoers and all that, but we gave so much to everywhere else. And he says, the primary thing we wanted to do was just to be able to help people individually as we saw they needed. And so that's what we did. And I'd travel around the country talking at AA conventions, and I invariably would find somebody that had a true need. And we'd give them this money. And that's what we did. And he says, now I'm in serious trouble financially. And he says, I haven't called anybody. You haven't heard from me. And I says, no. He says, nobody has. He says, the craziest thing, I'll go to my mailbox on some days, and there's a check in there coming from people in AA that I hadn't done that. So I got to be a part of this wonderful deal that goes around here and then comes back around. And it worked just like that. It really did. We lived for 5 years in that little mobile home, and I got to tell you something. Just this last April, we were in shape enough to buy another house. And I'd rather be back in the trailer house. A lot less grass to cut. Shovel, snow to shovel. Leaves to rake. You go to winterize a trailer house. You know how you do that? You crawl under it about that far, and you take this electric cord and you plug it in, and you're done. That was a wonderful time for us. It really was. It simplified our life such that we were able to live a life that we should have learned to live. Well, we're married. I don't know why I always forget that up here. And if she's in the crowd, it's a great deal of fun. 36 years. And so we learned to live pretty well these last 10 years now that we had missed before. More importantly, this time when I go through the steps, I'm still taking alcoholics through the steps. I got 23 or 24 guys. We're going through them right now. But when we do that, there is no more pulling of my punches. If I have some amends to make, they get done at the proper time. I've been done with my amends many, many times. And I thought I'd share that with you. I'm not one of those that believe you take the first 9 steps and then survive on 10, 11, 12, in case you haven't figured that out. And the reason I don't do that is it doesn't work for me. Every time I go through these steps and I get to this part of my life and this goes, I've gotten better. I've gotten weller. It's worked every time. It's never missed. And so I have the gentle attitude that the one says you do this thing once and then you go out and do whatever you want to do or wrong. And I generally share that pretty freely, and I hope I don't tick somebody off. What I really hope is somehow or another I'll encourage them to try what I do, because I really know it works. I really know it works. Now today, just to wrap this thing up, my children are 35, 33, and 30 years old. I have a 15-year-old grandson and then 4 other grandkids following up behind me. And I just have no way of knowing. I was sharing with somebody earlier. I don't talk about this, and I really don't. My youngest daughter was a kid that was just hell in school, and we had a Terrell Scott, and we were talking about the trouble we had. And she just hated me, and she hated Alcoholics Anonymous. And the reason she hated Alcoholics Anonymous is because that's where I generally was as they were growing up. My children grew up in AA meetings. They literally did. And now that they're young women on their own and all that, they love to save their money and go to an AA convention somewhere. None of them are alcoholics. But they love to go, and their husbands, yeah, that's right. And their husbands can't figure out why anybody would want to do that. They think it's crazy. And 3 years ago, they saved up and went down to the Music City Roundup. And my youngest daughter got to talking to some friends. You've been around AA for 30 years, you know a lot of people, you've met a lot of them, if you've talked a little bit like this, and you've gotten close to a great deal. And some of these people the girls hadn't seen for a while, Don, and a lot of them, so they really enjoy that. And the people growing up in AA, now this may sound crazy, were really their adult idols. I mean, that's what they had to look at when they were growing up, because that's all there was around our house was people in AA. And so they saw them seriously sick, and they saw them pretty damn well. And in between. And they were babysat by guys fresh out of prison. They really were. We left them for 3 days with Indian Jim. And that's what he called himself, and that's what he was. And he hadn't been out of Canyon City 6 weeks. And he offered to babysit him so we could go to a conference. You know, it went just fine. I don't have any idea what happened to Jim. I have no idea. I know he took a clock radio we had with him, and that was pretty fair payment. My daughter came to me, the youngest one came to me after that was over, and she says, I owe you and the men. And I didn't tell her I knew that. And she said, I have just discovered the harm I have caused with you, with how I have blamed you, with leaving us while you and Mom are off of doing AA and Al-Anon. We left them a lot, and I don't recommend that. But she made, and I've been trying to make amends for her for abandoning her like that over the years, but she came in and she made the amends to me. And she says, I realized down there that I've had a wonderful life. And with all my trouble and all your trouble that God has given us, she says, I know I can raise my 2 kids and I can survive it probably better than you can with me. And I looked at her and I said, well, I'm really enjoying watching you raise your children. Because your little girl is just like you, and I always said, I hope you get one. Just like that. And she said she knew that. All I know is because of these steps, as the result of these steps, I've had a spiritual awakening. And it happens to me once or twice a year, depending on how much time I go through the steps. And I've been woke up. And I've been woke up to the fact that this deal works. It really does. Give it a shot. Thank you very much for having me.